The date is September 19th, 1985, and the room is the Russell Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. Dee Snider of Twisted Sister sits at a witness table in a denim vest, staring down a row of senators who have never listened to his records but have already decided what they mean. Behind him, Frank Zappa waits his turn, and outside, television crews are setting up for the evening news. The official story is that this was a hearing about song lyrics. The truth is stranger. A rock band that built its entire image on cartoonish rebellion had just become, for one afternoon, a matter of American federal policy. That contradiction sits at the center of almost every story you're about to hear tonight. The bands that get remembered as dangerous were rarely dangerous in the way the headlines claimed. They were dangerous to institutions that depended on controlling teenagers, radio playlists, box office money, and public morality. And more than once, those institutions did not just complain. They convened hearings, filed charges, banned tours, opened FBI files, and in at least one case, tried to have a musician physically removed from the country. People still care about these stories because they feel like proof that music once had teeth. A Senate hearing over rock lyrics sounds absurd now, almost quaint, but in 1985 it produced the parental advisory sticker that still sits on album covers. A pop star's drug bust in the English countryside sounds like tabloid gossip, but it produced a newspaper editorial that changed how the British press treated rock stars for a decade. These are not just legends passed around by fans. They are documented in court transcripts, congressional records, immigration files, and newspaper morgues. And almost every one of them starts the same way. A performance or a lyric crosses a line nobody had clearly drawn, and the people in charge decide the line needs enforcing. Start with the hearing itself, because it is the cleanest example of the machine at work. The Parents Music Resource Center, founded in May 1985 by Tipper Gore, wife of then-Senator Al Gore, along with Susan Baker, wife of Treasury Secretary James Baker, had compiled a list that came to be known as the Filthy 15. Songs by Twisted Sister, Prince, Madonna, Judas Priest, WASP, and Motley Crue were flagged for violence, drug references, and sexual content. Twisted Sister's We're Not Gonna Take It made the list under the category of violence, despite Snider's insistence, later confirmed by the video and lyric sheet, that the song was about defiance, not assault. The Senate Commerce Committee, chaired by Senator John Danforth, held the hearing not to pass a law, but to apply pressure, because the Recording Industry Association of America was already negotiating with the PMRC behind closed doors. By November 1985, the RIAA agreed to a voluntary labeling system. The sticker that followed, Parental Advisory, Explicit Content, became one of the most photographed pieces of packaging in music retail history, stocked on shelves at Sam Goody and Tower Records, and eventually a selling point rather than a deterrent. That is the first thing people misunderstand. The government did not ban these bands. It never had to. The threat of legislation was often as effective as legislation itself. Now go back further. Because the machinery that produced that hearing room had been assembling since the 1960s, and the earliest and clearest case is the one involving the group least likely to get invited to Washington, the Kinks. In the summer of 1965, during a tour of the United States, the London band ran into trouble that had nothing to do with lyrics and everything to do with backstage behavior and union politics. Accounts differ on the exact trigger, but multiple sources point to an altercation at a television taping in San Francisco involving a union official from the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, compounded by onstage tension between guitarist Dave Davies and drummer Mick Avery that had already made headlines after a violent incident at a Cardiff show earlier that year. The American Federation of Musicians, the union controlling work permits for foreign acts performing in the U.S., effectively blacklisted the band from touring the country for 4 years, from 1965 until 1969. No formal court document spells out a single clean reason, and the union never issued a public statement explaining it in detail, which is exactly why the story still gets argued about by historians. What is not disputed is the outcome. The Kinks missed the entire British invasion wave in America, missed Monterey, missed the Summer of Love as a live act, and watched bands they had influenced, including The Who and the Rolling Stones, build American audiences while they were stuck performing almost exclusively in the UK and Europe. Ray Davies later wrote that the band forced the band inward, toward the very English observational songwriting of albums like The Kinks Are the Village Green Preservation Society, released in November 1968. A commercial punishment accidentally created an artistic identity. The Rolling Stones offer the most famous British case, and it begins in a farmhouse in West Wittering, Sussex, called Redlands, owned by Keith Richards. On the night of February 12, 1967, police raided a party there following a tip reportedly sold to the tabloid News of the World, allegedly by someone present that evening, a detail that has never been fully resolved and remains one of the more contested parts of the story. Officers found small amounts of drugs. Mick Jagger was found in possession of 4 amphetamine tablets he said he'd purchased legally in Italy, and art dealer Robert Fraser was charged with heroin possession. The subsequent trial in Chichester in June 1967 resulted in Jagger receiving a 3-month sentence, later suspended on appeal, and Richards receiving a year, also overturned. What made the case a turning point wasn't the sentence. It was the reaction of the press. On July 1, 1967, the Times of London ran an editorial by editor William Rees-Mogg titled "Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel?", arguing the punishment was disproportionate and that Jagger had effectively been tried for his celebrity and lifestyle rather than the offense itself. That editorial, from a conservative broadsheet not remotely aligned with youth culture, shifted public sympathy and is widely credited with helping get the sentences overturned on appeal. The Rolling Stones did not become dangerous because of drugs found in a country house. They became dangerous because the state's response to that discovery revealed how eager the establishment was to make an example of them, and the backlash to that overreach became part of the band's mythology forever. Cross the Atlantic again, to Detroit, and to a band whose story involves a jail sentence far heavier than anything the Stones faced. MC5, the proto-punk band from Lincoln Park, Michigan, were managed starting in 1967 by John Sinclair, a poet and activist who founded the White Panther Party in November 1968 as an explicitly political anti-racist ally organization to the Black Panthers. MC5's live shows, built around the anthem "Kick Out the Jams," recorded live at Detroit's Grande Ballroom and released by Elektra Records in 1969, were treated by local and federal authorities less like concerts and more like organizing rallies. Sinclair was arrested in 1969 for possession of 2 marijuana cigarettes and, in July of that year, sentenced to 9.5 to 10 years in prison, a punishment wildly disproportionate to the offense and widely understood at the time as retaliation for his political activity. The case became a cause, culminating in the John Sinclair Freedom Rally at Chrysler Arena in Ann Arbor on December 10, 1971, where John Lennon and Yoko Ono performed the song John Sinclair, alongside Stevie Wonder, Allen Ginsberg, and Bobby Seale. Sinclair was released just days later after the Michigan Supreme Court ruled the state's marijuana laws unconstitutional. MC5 itself had already splintered under the pressure of police surveillance, canceled shows, and Elektra Records dropping them after the label objected to language in the liner notes of "Kick Out the Jams," a phrase involving the word motherfuckers that led retailers, including the Hudson's department store chain in Detroit, to refuse to stock the album. The band that radio programmers were afraid to play was, within 2 years, broke and unable to book venues, not because their music failed, but because the machinery around them, from the label to the retailer to the county prosecutor, had decided the cost of supporting them wasn't worth it. That Lennon connection is not incidental. It leads directly into the case where the United States government moved furthest against a rock musician, the attempt to deport John Lennon. After Lennon and Yoko Ono relocated to New York in the summer of 1971, Lennon became increasingly involved in anti-war activism, including his appearance at the Sinclair rally and his association with radical figures like Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman. In February 1972, Senator Strom Thurmond sent a memo to Attorney General John Mitchell, later confirmed through Freedom of Information Act disclosures obtained by historian John Wiener in the 1980s and released in stages through the 1990s and early 2000s, suggesting that Lennon's visa should not be renewed and recommending deportation as, in the memo's language, a strategic countermeasure. The Nixon administration, worried Lennon might headline concerts capable of mobilizing young voters against the president in the 1972 election, pursued deportation proceedings through the Immigration and Naturalization Service, using a 1968 drug conviction in London, for cannabis resin found by Detective Sergeant Norman Pilcher as the legal basis. Lennon fought the case for nearly 4 years, with his legal team eventually arguing that Pilcher himself, later convicted of perjury and evidence planting in unrelated cases in the UK, made the original conviction unreliable. Lennon was granted permanent residency in July 1976, months before Nixon's own resignation 2 years earlier had already removed the political pressure that started the case. The FBI file compiled on Lennon during this period, later released in redacted form, ran to hundreds of pages, documenting surveillance of his phone calls, his associates, and even his attendance at protests. A songwriter who once appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show under camera instructions to avoid showing his lower body was, a decade later, deemed significant enough to warrant a federal surveillance file. That is not myth. That is a documented paper trail. Britain's own version of state discomfort with rock music arrived through a different channel, television, not immigration law. On December 1, 1976, the Sex Pistols appeared on Thames Television's early evening program Today, hosted by Bill Grundy, as a last-minute replacement guest. Grundy, visibly unprepared and reportedly having had a drink beforehand, baited the band, and guitarist Steve Jones responded with a string of profanities live on air, egged on by Grundy's continued provocation. The next morning, the Daily Mirror ran the headline, "The Filth and the Fury," and the tabloid firestorm that followed did more to build the Sex Pistols' notoriety than any single record could have. Regional TV franchises, EMI Records, and local councils began canceling shows outright. Of the 20 dates scheduled for the band's December 1976 tour, most were pulled by venues or local authorities before the band even arrived. When God Save the Queen was released in May 1977, timed deliberately against the Queen's Silver Jubilee, the BBC refused to play it on Radio 1, and the Independent Broadcasting Authority instructed commercial stations to do the same, effectively banning the single from national radio. Despite that ban, or because of it, the song reached number 2 on the UK singles chart in June 1977, with persistent claims, never confirmed by the British phonographic industry, that chart compilers altered the methodology that week to keep it from reaching number 1 during Jubilee celebrations. On June 7, 1977, the band performed the song from a boat on the River Thames near Westminster. Police boarded the vessel and arrested several members of the entourage, including manager Malcolm McLaren, on public order grounds. Questions about the Sex Pistols were raised in the House of Commons, with several MPs, including Conservative MP Marcus Fox, publicly condemning the record and calling for broadcasting restrictions to be enforced more strictly. A band that had existed as a functioning unit for barely 18 months had, by mid-1977, been discussed in Parliament, banned from state radio, and had its members arrested for playing a song on a boat. Return to America and to the courtroom, because by the late 1980s, the argument against rock music had shifted from lyrics and behavior to something almost science fictional, the claim that music could kill you through hidden messages. In December 1985, 2 young men in Sparks, Nevada, Raymond Belknap and James Vance, made a suicide pact after an afternoon listening to Judas Priest's 1978 album Stained Class. Belknap died. Vance survived with severe injuries and died 3 years later from complications, reportedly linked to a methadone overdose, though this too has been debated. Their families filed a lawsuit against Judas Priest and CBS Records, alleging that the song Better By You, Better Than Me contained a subliminal command, do it, embedded backward in the mix that had driven the teenagers to violence. The case, Vance v. Judas Priest, went to trial in Reno, Nevada in the summer of 1990 before Judge Jerry Carr Whitehead, with lead singer Rob Halford and guitarist Glenn Tipton testifying, and, at one point, demonstrating in court how the alleged phrase was an unintentional artifact of vocal phrasing and studio mixing rather than a deliberate message. On August 24, 1990, the judge ruled in favor of the band, finding no evidence of intentional subliminal content, and further ruling that even if such messages existed, subliminal audio had not been proven to compel behavior in the way the plaintiffs claimed. The band avoided liability, but the trial cost them, by some industry estimates, well over $500,000 in legal fees, and the association between heavy metal and hidden violence lingered in press coverage for years afterward, feeding directly into the same cultural anxiety that had already produced the PMRC hearings 5 years earlier. What connects Redlands, Ann Arbor, the Thames Boat Party, the Sparks Courtroom, and the Senate hearing room is not that these bands were secretly plotting harm. It's that each of them arrived at a moment when an existing institution, whether a police force, a union, a television network, a state legislature, or the U.S. Senate, felt its authority over youth culture slipping and reacted with the tools available to it: arrests, bans, blacklists, lawsuits, and hearings. Look closely at the aftermath of each case and a pattern emerges. The Kinks' American Band didn't kill the band. It redirected them towards some of their most acclaimed and least commercially successful work, records that only found their full audience decades later through reissues and critical reappraisal. The Rolling Stones' drug trial didn't end their career. The sympathetic press coverage helped cement Jagger and Richards as folk heroes rather than criminals, a status the band leveraged for the next 5 decades. MC5 did not survive their run-in with Elektra Records and Michigan law enforcement, breaking up by 1972, but their sound and John Sinclair's activism became foundational reference points for the punk movement that followed, cited directly by bands like The Clash and later Rage Against the Machine. The Sex Pistols' banned single, blocked from radio and from the top chart position, became arguably the most famous #2 single in British chart history, and the Grundy interview is now taught in British media studies courses as a case study in moral panic amplification. Judas Priest walked out of the Reno courtroom vindicated, but the trial's legal costs and reputational drag arguably slowed the band's commercial momentum at a point when other metal acts were breaking into the mainstream. And the PMRC hearings produced not censorship, but a sticker that within a few retail cycles became a marketing tool. Some acts, including certain rap and metal artists, later admitted the label helped sales among teenagers precisely because it signaled forbidden content. What people misunderstand today, watching clips of Dee Snider in a denim vest facing down a Senate committee, or Johnny Rotten sneering through a tabloid photograph, is the idea that these were spontaneous eruptions of rebellion meeting an outraged public. The record shows something more mechanical. Manager Malcolm McLaren openly discussed courting controversy as a promotional strategy for the Sex Pistols, and later interviews with people close to the band described the Grundy incident as chaos that got out of hand rather than a calculated stunt, though McLaren's own comments after the fact leaned into the myth that he had planned it all along. The PMRC's list wasn't compiled by outraged fans. It was compiled by the wives of powerful Washington figures with direct access to a Senate committee chairman. The Judas Priest lawsuit wasn't filed by a state prosecutor convinced of danger to public safety. It was filed by grieving families whose lawyers pursued a subliminal messaging theory that had no scientific consensus behind it, win or lose. Even the Redlands drug bust, so often framed as police simply enforcing the law, involved a tabloid newspaper allegedly financing the tip that triggered the raid in the first place, meaning the raid itself may have been manufactured content for a newspaper rather than routine policing. Nearly every one of these moments, examined closely, involves a business interest, a political calculation, or an institutional anxiety operating just behind the curtain of moral outrage. None of this erases what these bands actually built. The Rolling Stones remain one of the most durable touring acts in the history of popular music. MC5's guitar sound runs directly through punk and into modern garage rock revival bands. The Sex Pistols' 8-month run of chaos restructured what British guitar music sounded and looked like for a generation, feeding directly into the independent label movement of the late 1970s. Judas Priest continued recording and touring for decades after Reno, essentially unscathed in the eyes of their fan base. Twisted Sister's "We're Not Gonna Take It" outlived its Filthy 15 label to become a stadium anthem played at sporting events across the world. The government interventions, bans, and lawsuits did not kill these bands. In most cases, they accelerated the exact mythology the bands needed to matter. A band that gets banned from the radio, arrested on a boat, or hauled in front of a Senate committee gets a story that outlasts most chart positions. That is the part rarely mentioned in the retrospective footage. The institutions trying to shut these acts down were, almost every time, also the ones supplying the drama that made them legends. Rock and roll's reputation for danger was never just about the music. It was built out of union grievances in San Francisco hotel rooms, tabloid checkbooks in the English countryside, a 10-year prison sentence for 2 joints in Michigan, an FBI file typed up in Washington, a drunk TV host in London who couldn't get through an interview, and a Senate hearing room where a man in a denim vest had to explain, on the record, that a song about defiance was not a song about violence. Every one of these bands survived the institutions built to contain them, and every one of those institutions, without meaning to, became part of the story it was trying to erase. Rock mythology was never made only from rebellion. It was made from business pressure, paperwork, moral panic, and musicians who simply refused to stop playing while the machinery around them tried to decide what to do with the noise.